Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for my NACL week number 5 overview and analysis video here in the spring split. We are over halfway done with the regular season, which means we're getting very, very close to where these teams are kind of in a do or die mode. I'm super excited to go over everything. We definitely have a good idea of where a lot of these teams are sitting, but there are a lot of clusters in the NACL right now, which make a lot of these games interesting. So I'm excited. Hope you guys are as well. If you are, let me know down in the comments section below. What did you expect to happen this week? Did things live up to your expectations? Any players or teams that are over or underperforming? Your thoughts and your expectations in that regard. I'm always curious to know you guys' thoughts and opinions down below, but let's go ahead and get into the content, shall we? If you are new here, what we are going to do is go series by series, talking about the advantages and disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the series and a dud of the series for each series that we cover, and at the end of the video, I will be giving a player of the week and a dud of the week to tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. We will, of course, also be updating my personal power rankings from number 1 to number 10. Things are really starting to get clear, quite frankly, in terms of where a lot of the break points are for a lot of these teams. We've been talking about a top 3, and then like 4 to 6 kind of being in its own category, and then 7 and 8 kind of being this middle ground, and the bottom 2 at times being competitive, but not necessarily being, great in comparison. You just need to make sure that you are out of the danger zone or that you are in the top 6, depending on what your goals are. So a lot still to fight over, but let's go ahead and talk about day number 1, because we actually kicked off this week with one of the more interesting series to talk about, in my opinion, one that didn't go as expected, if only because there was an entirely new team playing in it. It was DarkZero Dragonsteel taking on NACL Airport, and NACL Airport's going to pick up the 2-0 win, and this looks like a gigantic win on paper, because DarkZero had been undefeated not only in terms of series score, but in terms of game score heading into this series. However, this is DarkZero Light. This is what I guess you could consider the quote-unquote B team of DarkZero, but that feels unfair to how good this roster is. This was the original Polestar roster before everything with that org ended up happening over the course of this offseason, and they got picked up by DarkZero to get a chance to play at least a little bit in the NACL, to make sure that if they ran into some roster problems, which they are currently running into, that they would have some backup options, and they decided to play all 5 of the DarkZero Light roster here against NACL Airport, so almost entirely a different team, and they do get 2-0'd, but this is more a plus to NACL Airport than it is a minus to DarkZero, in my opinion. Obviously, I don't know what the future of this organization is now that their jungler, Yuji, has been picked up by Team Liquid in the LTA. Obviously, it's not an ideal circumstance for them, but Kryra might become more of a mainstay, a regular on this team if that becomes the case. And, while I think there are some interesting things to take away here for DarkZero, I think what was also kind of clear is that NACL Airport was definitely the better team in this series, and I think you can kind of feel comfortable about saying that. So we can go ahead and talk about it. I think that there were multiple avenues to approach this from the side of NACL Airport. First, I gotta note, this DarkZero Light roster has not been playing competitive games on stage, with a, real thing on the line. They've just been playing scrims, and so it's gonna be a pretty different environment, all things considered, to get on the stage. I'm not gonna expect them to be perfect from day number 1, but NACL Airport kind of outplayed them in almost every single way, in every single lane. You can look at a lot of different avenues where they were able to generate a lead. Now, Game 2 was a bit closer, but I'm actually going to agree with the broadcast and give player of the series to TF Blade on the top side. I think Spica or Double Lift would have felt like pretty obvious choices as well, and I'm certainly not going to begrudge anybody who would say that Spica is player of the series, or that Double Lift, because he was the follow-through, is the player of the series. But I think if TF Blade was worse in this series, this becomes a lot harder for NACL Airport to win. He was the tank on the front line that was perfect at eating up basically everything DarkZero wanted to throw at NACL Airport in a lot of these fights, creating space, creating separation, and then also just not being a problem at all for NA in a lot of these side lane situations. It was a really impressive game for me when it came to TF Blade, because I think the concern for him individually as a player is that he was going to be more of that solo queue mentality of I'm either going to win real hard or I'm going to lose real hard. I'm going to pick aggressive things on the top side. The team play might not necessarily be there, but he was kind of the linchpin in this comp and in this team to really make the rest of it work as well as it did. And to me, that's so impressive and so important to see from NACL Airport and from TF Blade as a player, especially going into someone like Tenacity, who definitely is the most proven of the players on this DarkZero team of everybody. I love Toasty. Spawn has been a player that's played in Tier 1 before. Kryra and Cryogen, I think, are both really good young players. Kryra, in particular, I really like. But for TF Blade to be going into a player in Tenacity that most would consider better than him and be able to not only stabilize on the top side, have decently good laning phases, but be better in a lot of these team fights, it's just a really good look for Near Airport and for TF Blade, so he's going to get my player of the series. But like I said, you want to give it to Spica in the jungle for the Maokai and the Jarvan. I think that that's totally fair. He was really kind of the playmaker here. He was everywhere he needed to be. He was involved in almost everything that Near Airport did. Double Lift was the damage carry throughout a lot of this series. It's nice to see him picking things like Xayah back up, because I was a bit concerned in the open qualifiers that he was going to be a bit of a Jhin or Ashe merchant in the NACL. That has not been the case at all. He's been a lot more flexible than that. Biofrost was very good. Pobelter, ironically enough, was the one player that was a little too far forward in some of these circumstances, but DarkZero also put a lot of attention into the mid lane, and so I'm not going to, flame Pobelter at all for that. This guy's been terrific over the course of 2025. This is a very good team, and while it doesn't quite carry the same weight as beating the main DarkZero roster would, Near Airport coming out here and beating a team that I think a lot of us would consider top 4 if they were playing on their own in the NACL, like that's a very big win for Near Airport, and I'm excited to see them continue to grow, because they have gotten better and they certainly have gotten more versatile as they've played more games. And then for Dragonsteel on the other side, it's hard to really get a grasp of where exactly we want to place this team right now. Like I said, I think they would probably come in around number 4 in terms of my power rankings if they were just this starting 5, but this is also the first actual regular season game that these guys have played all year long. It's not like they've gotten a ton of practice together up until this point. I'm sure they've been scrimming, and they were obviously scrimming in the offseason as well when they thought they were going to be Polestar. It's not like they've never played together, but this is a big challenge for your first series in Tier 2, especially for a player like Cryogen who's never played at this level. Kryra's had a cup of coffee at this level for CCG. These aren't the most established players in the universe, and they just didn't have the firepower to keep up here. I do want to point out some positives. I think Jungle Mid was really good in this series. They were the strength for me. Kryra was at least trying to make some plays and wasn't really making a ton of mistakes, and Toasty is a player that I'm super invested in. I thought it was a crime that Toasty didn't have a team going into the year, and obviously I'm glad he's getting a chance to play here, but both of them I think were fine. I expected more from Tenacity on the top side. He's probably the best player in terms of current ability on this team, and he wasn't better than TF Blade. In fact, he was worse than TF Blade. That's really the matchup that I expected to go differently when these two teams played, but again, it's first series. You don't want to freak out. Spawn and Cryogen were predictably not quite as stable. Cryogen's going to get my dud of the series here for the Fiddlesticks and Leona games, specifically mostly for that Fiddlesticks game in game number 1. He's an interesting player, but Cryogen also has the least amount of experience of almost anybody in the entire league. Now, obviously, we've got a lot of players who don't have Tier 2 experience right now, but Cryogen's not exactly the, player that you would expect to step in and be able to go up against Double Lift and Biofrost regularly from day number 1, and so obviously him getting thrust into this situation is probably not great for him. I'm expecting growth. We'll see how much he actually gets to play and how much this team actually gets to play, but the bot lane was definitely in favor of Near Airport. Spawn was predictably not very useful in their losses. He's just one of those players that he's kind of built in that Teddy mold, as I always call it, the Patrick mold, whatever you want to call it, where he's very stable as a bot lane player, where not going to be the most aggressive 2v2 player in the world, but will show up to team fights and will be very good in those instances if you are able to get him gold as a secondary carry. He's valuable in that role, but you don't really want him as a primary option. When this team is losing, or when Spawn's team in general is losing, he's likely just going to blend into the background a bit more, and that's kind of what happened here. So overall, it's not shocking to see DarkZero lose this, but I do think there are some interesting takeaways, but most of what I'm taking away from this series is on Near Airport's side. I think TF Blade has looked awesome over the past couple of weeks. This might be the best I've ever seen him look in terms of the expectations and what I need to see in order to feel good about him on the top side in big situations. Spica continues to be the best player in the league, especially with UG getting promoted, and Double Lift and Biofrost are really in form. Even with Pobelter, I wouldn't say having a bad series, but certainly not being kind of the star that he's been so far this split. This team had no trouble with a team like DZ Light, and that is a really big plus in their favor. I'm excited to see them continue to grow. Then moving on to our second series of day number 1, and a predictable outcome to follow up on that one. It was Luminosity Gaming taking on Apex Mission Impossible, and Luminosity is going to pick up the 2-0 win, as we would have anticipated between these two teams. This was closer than I think I thought it would be, if only because I think AMI at least tried to do some things, but that was mostly in game number 1. Tomio completely ran the map in that first game. The Vi was a huge problem that AMI really had no answer to, and then in game number 2, they draft this really proactive comp and then do almost none of that proactivity passivity. They just kind of sit there and just let themselves lose. I get it, right? You're scared to play against Luminosity, especially after that first game where it felt like, a lot of the plays you were attempting to make didn't necessarily work out, but I definitely wanted to see a bit more coming out from AMI because I think they've looked better than what they showed here throughout a lot of this split. But I think at that point, we're really like, getting into the nitty gritty. Like, I didn't expect this team to win a game in this series, so I probably shouldn't be too critical on them in that case. Tomio was unbelievable. He's going to get player of the series. I didn't really have to think about this at all. He ran that first game on Vi, was everywhere he needed to be, completely outplayed LoJazz in terms of how he played a lot of the mid-game tempo, and got the Azir into a great spot, got the Lucian into a great spot. Obviously, Zeyzal was part of that as well, but I thought Tomio had a really excellent start to this series, and the Nidalee game was still very good. I don't think it was quite as, dominant as the Vi game was, if only because Nidalee doesn't offer you as many options, but it still was very solid. Insanity playing up to his name in that second game, flashing in on Victor in a lot of those fights to just try and cause as much chaos and havoc as he possibly could. It was great stuff. So Tomio looking great. Insanity, I thought, played really well, like I said, in the mid lane. Nice to see both of them really step up. I think they've been good over the course of this split, but I've been really favoring Tactical as kind of the main guy on this team. I think Insanity has been a little bit over-aggressive at times and has gotten caught out a bit more than maybe you would want. I still like to see that he's not scared. He's not shying away from any of these plays, and quite frankly, I don't know why I would ever expect Insanity to be scared. This guy has never played scared in his entire life. So good on the jungle mid duo. Fake God continues to be awesome. The Aatrox legacy ends up living on. I think they called that out on the cast, where it's like all those former 100 Thieves top laners who are so good at Aatrox someday passing it down to Fake God. It continues to be a gigantic nuisance for every team that tries to play into it. Fake God is incredibly good at this level. He's arguably been the best performing top laner so far in the NACL. I certainly think it's an argument outside of Zamudo, because he's been unreal, but Fake God has been awesome, and he decimated Decoy in that lane. Tactical and Zeyzal took more of a backseat role in terms of resources in this series, but that's not to say that they weren't fantastic. Tactical on the Lucian in particular in game 1, I thought was really fun. The Corki also really good in game number 2. He's positioning perfectly for a lot of these fights. There's really nothing else to say. Tactical's great. Zeyzal was great on the Milio. I've always liked him on Enchanters and on these lanes that are going to try to win 2v2. I think he's very good in that role. So for Luminosity, just happy to see that, they took care of business as expected, that Tomio in particular can really dominate a series like this, because I think I was waiting on that Tomio performance that screamed like, oh, I'm going to be in competition for the best jungler in the league, not just a good, but a great Tomio performance, and this is definitely that. And then for AMI on the other side, not really a ton to talk about. I am going to give dud of the series to LoJazz, if only because I do think he should have done more in game number 2. You're drafting things like Volibear to play alongside Misfortune and Yone. You want to be more aggressive in the early game, and then you didn't really go for any plays, and I'm not sure if that's a LoJazz thing. I'm not sure if it was an AMI laners kind of thing, but I was a bit frustrated watching this team play and watching a Volibear just try to farm up against an Italy. It just felt like a very weird situation all in all, and so because of that, LoJazz is getting dud of the series for me, but I consider Decoy on the top side because he just was not involved in basically anything throughout either of these games. Fake God kind of embarrassed him in that second game on the Scion, and, I like Decoy, but this was just one of those matchups where he got completely outplayed. You got to live with that every once in a while. Fimony was definitely the weaker of these two mid laners. Insanity had all of the pressure in the world and played off of his jungle incredibly well, so you want to give him credit in that regard. Baz and Pocus, I think, were fine. Pocus has been very up and down, I would say, over the course of this split. Baz certainly wasn't good. I'm not trying to sit here and say that he was phenomenal and that his positioning was great. He got caught out a couple of times in places that you wouldn't want, but I think the top side of the map, and specifically the middle of the map, was a little bit more pressing in terms of an issue for AMI, and I think just their lack of aggressiveness and, quite frankly, their scared gameplay in game number 2 kind of caught me off guard. This is not a team that I think has played scared all that much so far this split, and to see it happen here in game 2 was a bit disappointing, but again, not a shocking outcome. Nobody is surprised by AMI dropping 0-2 to Luminosity. Luminosity moves to 5-1. That puts all 3 of the top 3 teams, I believe, at 5-1. It's becoming very interesting to see what order these teams are going to go in, especially if DarkZero is going to start playing their DarkZero Light team a little bit more often. Luminosity now has a pathway to try to get into first place, at least for the playoffs, and that would be really fun for them, but I want to see Tomio and Insanity in particular keep this up. I trust Fake God on the top side. I trust Tactical on the bot side, but Tomio and Insanity, they can be the best mid-jungle duo in the entire league. They just have to get a bit more consistent. This was a good sign of that. But then moving on now to day number 2, and we get a middle of the table clash, which is honestly the most interesting thing we could get in the NACL. It's Blue Otter taking on Conviction, And Conviction is going to pick up the 2-1 series win. I think it's become clear that it's Conviction and CCG kind of fighting it out for that top 4 spot alongside the big 3 at the moment. Blue Otter is just not in that conversation at the moment, unfortunately. That being said, this was a pretty close series. There were a couple of moments where it felt like Blue Otter could come out on top. Their game 2 was pretty clinical, pretty solid, and some great performances, especially from the solo laners throughout a lot of this series, but Conviction just had a little bit more going for them, and that's why they're able to walk out of this. All 5 members, I would say, for Conviction looking good. Maybe 4 members more so than 5. Shout out Hoarder, who was fine on the top side, but I think it was the rest that really separated themselves for me, so we can go ahead and get into that. Now, Darkwings is going to get my player of the series, mostly for that Hui game in game number 3. It was really crucial that he stepped up because Samikin came to play here today, specifically on the Orianna in game 2, and then the Mel in game 3, where he had really good games in both of those, but Darkwings was even more influential in that 3rd and final game. It's nice to see 2 mid laners both show up and both really perform at a high level. I'm really excited specifically to see Darkwings play well because honestly, in the matchups against some of the better teams in the league, he has struggled a bit more than some of his teammates have. I think, players like Chrome and Kisno have actually looked pretty good against some of the top tier teams, but Darkwings not always the most consistent against those more consistent mid laners. And so going up against someone like Samikin, who is very talented and who was on his game today and still being able to come out on top and be the better mid laner and, be the most valuable player in that most valuable game, that is a very, very important thing for Conviction to have. And Darkwings is a good player. The problem with Darkwings has never been his good games, it's been his bad games. He's been an inconsistent player his entire time in tier 2. It's nice to see that upside is definitely still there. We just want to see him tap into it a bit more frequently. I think Broadcast ended up giving player of the series to Chrome. It's almost entirely got to be for the Callista. I did not consider Chrome for player of the series here. I probably would have given it to Kisno before I gave it to Chrome, but he still played really well. Like, the Callista was awesome, and you probably can't give that champion over to Conviction in any way. You got to ban that out. Even in a game number 3, he's just too good on it, and the team in general is just too good playing around it to really take advantage of it at all. I loved Manui kind of transitioning more into those enchanters. This is something we've talked about a lot over the course of this split. The teams that are good at enchanters should not be scared of going for them and should not shy away from playing Milio in game 2 or Soraka in game number 3. I think you can get away with that more now than you could a couple of months ago with the lack of lane swaps. 2v2 is so relevant that if you do have one of these lanes that just is really strong early, you can get one of those big gold leads and transition that into skirmishes that other teams are going to have a really hard time dealing with. And so, I like the idea, I like the draft in game number 3 to really set up this bot lane to be in a good spot, and Manui is definitely getting more comfortable in the role as he plays more games. Kisno was awesome here. Like I said, I really considered him for player of the series. He was definitely the better jungler in this series, which is a great sign. The Wukong in game 3, the Xin Zhao, though, in game number 1 really stood out to me. He probably would have been my player of the game in that game 1. Hoarder was the only player where it felt like he was just a little bit over-eager, but it was not in a negative way. He just was super aggressive in this series, and I'm a big fan of what he's been so far in tier 2. I think he's probably been the 4th best top laner in the league so far, and so just a lot of good things to talk about for Conviction. Happy to see them get back above 500. They've had a rough go of things in terms of their schedule over the past couple of weeks after starting 2-0. It's nice to see them go back into a bracket that they can actually win and take advantage of that. And then for Blue Otter on the other side, they just didn't have the firepower across the board to be able to overcome Conviction. And now I really am starting to get concerned. This is still a top 6 team, in my opinion. They've only lost to teams that are up, in that upper echelon or randomly to Winthrop in week number 1. But there are real concerns with this team at the moment. I think jungle support did not look very good at all in this series. Whether you want to give dud of the series to Music or Rovex is up to you. I think Music was worse in their losses, especially in the Viego game, game number 3 here, but Rovex was probably not as dominant in their win, where the Neferi was kind of a big driving force. I'm giving it to Music because if you isolate the 2 games that they ended up losing, I think Music was easily the dud of the series, and that's why I'm going to give it to him. But again, I can understand that if him being so good in that second game kind of disqualifies him for that, but I'm just not a big fan of Music, especially when he has to play from behind. Like, I think he's a good player, trust me. I just don't think he's very flexible and versatile, and I think a player like Kisno has kind of proven to be better, at least right now on the other side of this. He's taken a step back from last year. I've not been impressed with his form. Rovex, I think, has also taken a step back. Levitate has taken a major step back from last year. I thought this was going to be like the breakout year. I thought he was on Scary Jerry, like, trajectory, where next year he was going to be in tier 1 and be somebody that teams were going to start building around at the tier 1 level. That is not happening at all. He has been a below average AD carry at this level so far this split, and part of that is just the team setup, but it's really not good to see him not taking over in the 2v2 the way that he did last year. That's kind of what we wanted to see. I do want to give a lot of props to the solo laners despite what their KDAs are. Samikin was just tremendous in this series, definitely the best player on Blue Otter. The Orianna and the Mel both were really, really good games from him. I'm hopeful he's going to be able to keep that up because he's not always been that throughout this split. And then Quacker was also, in my opinion, really good and really active on the map. I don't think he's going to get enough credit for being somebody that just tries to involve himself in almost everything that happens. That's a big reason why I've always been higher on Quacker. The problem is some of those times, like sometimes he will go to a play to try and influence it and will make it a little bit worse just by the way he plays it out. I don't think that happens entirely often, and I don't think that happened a ton in this series, but I do like his aggressiveness and his willingness to try to take a lot of these fights and to try to operate under that, guys. But, you know, overall, outside of the solo laners, I don't think this was a pretty good series for Blue Otter, especially outside of Game 2. Like, Games 1 and 3, I just don't think we're very good. Game 1 was a slaughter. So, you know, for Blue Otter, a lot they still need to fix, and this team is not where they wanted to be going into this year. They expected top 4. They're much closer to bottom 4 than they are to top 4. And then for Conviction, on the other side, this is a good team. I've kept them at number 4 in my power rankings, despite everybody kind of leaning towards CCG for that spot. I do think it's very close between those two teams, and I'm excited to see them eventually play against each other, but don't sleep on Conviction. This team is really good, and I think they've got a lot going for them, and this was just another example of that. Then moving on to our second series of day number 2 in the second half of our week, which starts here. It was Polestar taking on CCG Esports, and CCG is going to pick up the 2-1 series win. Obviously, this is a pretty nice win for them. They wanted to be able to come out here and dominate. They dropped game number 1, and I was starting to get a bit concerned because they really should not be losing games at all to a team like Polestar. Polestar should barely be picking up wins against anybody at this point in terms of how things have gone, but they righted the ship and they dominated the back half here, and that's all you really need to see. It just got to make sure that you get 2 very good wins if you are going to drop that game 1. But for Pulse, I do think they're getting better. Like, I think that there are some positive things to start saying about this team because at the beginning of the split, we talked about, are they even going to win a game in the NACL? That has obviously been overcome at this point, but they've been pretty interesting to watch, and their aggressiveness does sometimes lend them advantages that other teams kind of near the bottom of the standings just aren't getting. I'm not saying that they're perfect by any means, but I am saying that I do think that there is more to this Pulse team than maybe what we thought going into the year. That being said, 0-6 is still kind of what we expected and probably where they should be in terms of their talent level. They're just not getting steamrolled in the ways that we thought they would, so that's good for them. But for CCG, player of the series for me is going to go to Dardoch. In their 2 wins, he was definitely the most relevant, even if he probably was kind of a big reason they lost game number 1 on the Vi. He was way too far forward, played really greedy in that game, and ended up giving over a ton of resources to Pulse really without any way to back it up. I think that's the reason the broadcast did not give him player of the series, but I leaned in favor of him mostly for that Mundo game in game number 3. He was the main character of that third and final game. I don't even think it's really all that up for debate. No one could stop Mundo. He went where he pleased, and Dardoch continues this really good run of form he's been on as of late. He got player of the series last week in their win as well, and so he's just been in a good run of form as of late, and I'm excited to see Dardoch back into good graces. It's been a little while since he's performed well at a tier 2 level or higher, and so nice to see him, you know, playing really well for the CCG team that really does need like a veteran presence that can really carry games consistently coming out of the mid lane. That's not to say, you know, players like Array and Breezy have not been great. They've been excellent, super stable, and honestly really good in the bot lane, and they were really good once again in this series. But Dardoch stepping up, I think, adds a different layer to this team. That is the reason most people did not consider them one of the best teams in the league at the start of the year, because we didn't know what we were going to get out of Dardoch. So happy to see that out of him. Aojun ended up getting player of the series on the broadcast. I'm certainly not quite as in on this one as maybe the broadcast was. I'm still a little bit lower on the plays he ended up making. The Taliyah had some ups and downs. The Azir in game 1 had some ups and downs. It's really mostly, I would assume, for the Aurora in game number 2 that he's getting player of the series. Adam was very greedy, very aggressive on the other side, as he has been throughout every single series that he's played in the NACL. He's certainly not playing scared, but Aojun, I think, answered it well. You maybe wanted to see a bit more consistency come out of him, and I'm just not sold that like the high-end plays are the highest that CCG has, but I do think that there is progression happening here, and these are the kinds of matchups you want to see Aojun actually play really well in, and I think he played fine here. I didn't understand player of the series, but I do think he played well. Big shout out to Array and Breezy. Again, they're maybe one of, if not the most consistent bot lane in the entire league right now. They just win. No matter the matchup, like the Misfortune Fiddlesticks actually does end up working out for them in the bot lane. Breezy has been spectacular, and Array is always a very capable and very stable starting AD carry. So glad to see this bot lane continue to function. And Crimson was the better top laner as well, even if he wasn't quite as eye-catching. So nice win by CCG. Maybe you wanted to see them dominate the series a bit more, but games 2 and 3 were what we expected. You just maybe didn't love the loss in game number 1, but but let's give that as a positive over to Pulse, shall we? This team has really struggled to find anything so far this split. They are definitely playing better now than they have before, the last couple of weeks, but there still is a lot of growing to go through. Dud of the series was kind of hard, though, because I think a lot of the players who had the biggest negative plays were also the ones that were making the biggest positive plays, most notably Adam in the mid lane, who I have been pretty critical of on this channel. He obviously leads the team in deaths, as he does almost every single series coming out of the mid lane, but he was a big reason why they were able to create so much, especially in that game 1 on the Yone. So I'm giving Dud of the series to Dr. Calculus. On the top side, it felt like he was the most disconnected from the rest of the team. Some of that is just being the top laner, but the Silas game in game number 3 did not work. It was not that counter pick that I think he wanted on the top side, and it ended up really crashing and burning for Pulse, and I just don't think that was really an ideal set of circumstances. I think the rest of this team played fine, though. Bio continues to be, in my opinion, the best player on this team, someone who I've actually been pretty interested in over the course of this split. Hub and Tubbs played great. Hub obviously with a pretty good KDA. He was enabled. He didn't really make any major mistakes. Tubbs, I thought, did a good job of being able to set him up. Tubbs was, probably the best he's been so far in Tier 2 in this series, so you don't want to freak out too much for Pulse. There's some pluses and some minuses, but at the end of the day, no one is surprised that they ended up losing to CCG. I think the positive is just that they are starting to generate momentum. Remember, bottom 2 is not immediately relegated. They go into a relegation tournament, and so if Pulse gets 0 wins over the course of this split in terms of series, and they go 0-9 and they go down into the relegation tournament, they can still play for a chance to be back in Tier 2 for the summer split. It's not just, Pulse doesn't win a series in Tier 2, that means they're done. If they can continue to level up, who knows what can happen in a relegation tournament? We've seen a ton of upsets there before. Wouldn't be surprised to see one again, although Pulse definitely has a mountain to climb to get there, but CCG is way better than that. I don't know if this team has officially locked themselves into playoffs just yet, but they've definitely gotten very close. At 4-2, they're going to be one of the more dangerous teams in the entire league, and certainly a team that's kind of, breaking down the wall, knocking on the door of trying to get into that upper echelon. But then moving on now to our final day of the week here, day number 3, and we kicked off day 3 with a matchup between Conviction and Winthrop University, where Conviction is going to pick up the 2-0 win. They're going to keep their good run of form going. I say good run of form, they were 0-2 in their last 2 series before entering this week, but they get some more beatable opponents, and they do take advantage of it as they move themselves to 4-2 and really establish themselves, again, also with CCG near the top of that best of the rest category that we had been talking about. For Winthrop, to me, this is crashing back down to earth. I was lower on the CLOL teams heading into this year. The collegiate teams, both Supernova and Winthrop, I had them 7-8 coming into the split. I feel like I've been pretty vindicated in that regard, where that's kind of how they've performed so far, but Winthrop still has some things that they can build off of. I think that there were a couple of performances in this series that were okay, a couple of performances across this split that have been all right, but overall, Conviction has definitely been the better team. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Chrome is going to get my player of the series, although Dark Wings, Chrome, one of those two, whoever you want to give it to, it's kind of up to you. I definitely considered Manui for this as well. I think those 3 players were really kind of the stars of the team in this one. Not that Hoarder and Kisno did not play well. I thought they did play really well in this series. It's just, player of the series is the one that really dominates. Chrome was the best player in game number 2, which is kind of what led me into picking him, but if you wanted to give it to Dark Wings for a second straight series, I think that is entirely fair. If you wanted to give it to Manui, because I think that Poppy in particular in game number 1 was phenomenal, then I think that's also your prerogative, right? The Poppy game was probably the best individual game. I think Chrome was more consistent across both those, so he is going to get it. Chrome is awesome. Aaron's always been awesome. As a player, he's been somebody that I've really praised on this channel in the past. I talked really highly about last year when we were talking about, this Winthrop team. We were talking about Aaron as a player that really could make a big leap going into the next year, kind of become one of the more consistent and more high upside AD carries in the league, kind of similar to how we talked about Levitate, but it's nice to see that he has actually carried that forward outside of Levitate, who has not really been able to match that so far this year. So credit to him. Excited to see that growth continue. Manui gets better at support game over game. Really excited to see the growth that has happened for him individually. Like I said, the Poppy was probably the best game of the entire series that anybody played, and if you wanted to give him player of the series for that, I'm certainly not going to disagree with you. He mega gapped only 35 in this series, and that is gigantic for Conviction's ability to win these games, because if the bot lane is going to be winning consistently, bot lane's so important not only in the meta right now, but in the NACL for a lot of these teams. Look at Winthrop, like mobility and only 35 are the strength of their individual team, and so if Manui is going to come out and be able to win the 2v2 and, really dominate a lot of those team fights, it really makes the game a lot easier. So Credit to Manui, Darkwings had a phenomenal week. Like, everything you could have wanted out of Darkwings. He played some good competition. Sword, I think, has been in good form for Winthrop on the other side. Samikin was obviously fantastic in their first series, but he was just straight up better than both of them. He was the most consistent piece, I would say, across the series. Just maybe didn't have the same kind of highs that Chrome or Manui ended up having. The Azir, the Tristana, both games were really good, and, you know, I'm just excited to see Darkwings back in form. He was like a long-time channel darling, like going back to like 2022, 2023. I was hyping this guy up for a long time, so it's still exciting to see him perform well here. Kisno continues to play well. Hoarder was really good on the top side. I'm such a big fan of Hoarder. I think this guy could be like a future like star top laner at this level. He is that good. Conviction just felt strong in this series. They felt like the better team, and that's what you want to see. And for Winthrop, I hate to say it, but I'm really not surprised by the fact that they are struggling a lot more down the stretch. I just didn't really see this team as the type of roster that could compete with those upper squads. You know, we've seen Conviction and CCG kind of separate themselves from the other members of that pack, and Winthrop is just not on that level, and part of that is because they are pretty one-dimensional in terms of their playstyle. Bot lane is too integral to this team's success for them to do much else. Only 35 having a bad series and really not having pressure on the bottom side of the map is game-altering, game-warping, and series warping for Winthrop. He's going to get dud of the series. Gigantic support gap in this one from Manui, and this is pretty unacceptable for only 35. He's supposed to be the veteran, the internationally experienced player here for Winthrop, and he just did not perform up to that in this series. Mobility was fine, but again, this bot lane 2v2 needs to be the lane that's really taking over. That's just not happened as of late. Sword, I think, has been in decent form. This was not a bad series from him, but he certainly wasn't pushing the tempo. And then Denethor was a positive on the top side. He was really aggressive and actively looking for a lot of different plays for Winthrop, but Hoarder was also good on the other side, and he just didn't have the team to back him up. Wilson, I think, has been decently disappointing so far. Not disappointing, because this is kind of what we expected, but he's been the 8th best jungler in the league, as we kind of anticipated. Winthrop just, again, are crashing back down to earth, in my opinion, in terms of expectation. I still have them under Supernova in terms of my, you know, predictions and my power rankings. I don't know if that's necessarily going to show itself in the standings, but I don't think Winthrop is like a top-tier team. I don't think really either of the collegiate teams, or any of them outside of Maryville, are top-tier NACL teams right now. I just think that that is the way that things have unfolded. Conviction kind of proved that in this series, and until Winthrop gets a little bit more flexible in terms of how they want to play their mid games, I don't think it's going to get better. And then for Conviction, like I said, this is a really good team. I've kept them at number 4 in my power rankings, despite everybody else kind of moving CCG up after the past couple of weeks. I have real faith that this team is going to continue to be very good, and I think this was the series that really reassured me that I definitely am looking in the right direction with them. But that's going to bring us to our final series of the week here, and it was a good one, a 1-4 matchup, which really matters at this point. It's Blue Otter taking on Supernova, and Blue Otter is going to pick up the 2-0 victory. Not only is this very good, obviously, for Blue Otter, this is a necessary win to get them back into at least a decent spot, and not just a decent spot, this puts them in top 6 in terms of the standings, just because of how clustered the bottom of the standings is right now. But this is a bad loss for Supernova, not only dropping the series, but not winning a single game. You're 1-5, you're 2-10. This team is sitting in the bottom 2 right now. They might have to go to the relegation tournament, and nothing is guaranteed going to the relegation tournament. I definitely can guarantee that in terms of how things are going. So Supernova is definitely on worry alert at this point, but we'll go ahead and talk about that when we get into it. Let's start with Blue Otter. Player of the series for me is going to go to Music. He got done of the series earlier this week for the loss to Conviction. He gets player of the series here in their win over Supernova. This was definitely much more of the Music that we got used to at the end of last year, where he's playing a lot of carries and establishing tempo in the mid game. That's what he did really well in 2024. It's really, really good to see him get back into that form here in this one. The Neferi in game 1, the Viego in game number 2, two very hyper carry oriented picks. It's just nice to see that he can still do this at such a high level. The Neferi, the Viego, both of them I think looked very good, specifically the Neferi in game number 1, where Keel was just obliterated in terms of how that matchup ended up going. Music got a gigantic lead in the early game, and Keel fell for the negativity over and over and over and over again. It became a real problem for Supernova that ended up being unwinnable in game number 1, and then the Viego still was able to take over that second game. I didn't really have to think about player of the series too much. Music definitely was the one that kind of ran away with that award, but I do want to give a big shout out to the bot lane here for Blue Otter. Levitate and Rovex playing what I would consider probably their best series in 2025 up until this point. Shogo and Rhino have had their problems, and trust me, we'll get into that. on the side of Supernova. They've certainly not been the most consistent bot lane in the world, but Levitate and Rovex absolutely demolished this matchup, played into a lot of these hyper carries with their own hyper carries, and just were way more proactive at being able to get gold onto themselves. Levitate was super consistent as a carry. This is the version of Levitate we got more used to in 2024 as opposed to what we had, so far this year, but Rovex really shined, I think, in terms of his creation opportunities in this series. So credit to him. Quacker and Samikin were the ones to kind of, keep this team afloat in that series earlier this week. They continued their good form by being better than their opposition, but they weren't quite as needed as dominant carries as maybe they were earlier this week with Music and the bot lane stepping up, and so they took more background roles here, and I think that that is the best case scenario for Blue Otter. Quacker can be a really aggressive player, but getting him isolated in the 1v1 I think is a positive, and Samikin is awesome as a secondary carry, facilitative type of mid laner. If Levitate is going to step up, and if Music is going to be a carry option, I think that really increases the dangerousness of Blue Otter, and, I think this was just a really good example of what we liked about the team going into the year, and what they haven't shown us a ton of in 2025. So nice to see that. And for Supernova, it's just all crashing down right now. This team, like I said, 1-5, 2-10, they're in the danger zone at the current moment. We're past the halfway point, and this team is in the relegation spot. And so it's really not a great place for them to be. And I think a lot of things are just kind of not working the way they thought. Stray and Asila, I think we considered them to be players that would take some time to get used to playing at this level. But Keel, Shogo, and Rhino were supposed to be the strengths of this team. They've been the weaknesses of this team. They've been the three players that I think have impressed me the least so far. Not to say that Stray and Asila have been excellent. Asila's been fine in the mid lane. I certainly don't have major issues with how he's been playing, but Keel had a miserable game number 1, an insta-game losing game number 1 on the Vi, just horrendous stuff, and Shogo has no flexibility. That's what we're learning. It is hyper carry or bust, and we've seen that in the past. He's been picking things like Jinx and Kog'Maw super regularly. He pulls out the Smolder in game number 1, and the problem with that is that this team becomes so inflexible that it's really easy to draft against them, and now the bot lane is being taken advantage of. Levitate and Rovex have been underwhelming, we'll just say, in 2025, and even they showed up and demolished this 2v2. It's not a good look. I've already gone on a couple of rants about how I don't think Rhino has been playing well. Shogo's getting dud of the series here. This was a really bad performance from Shogo, and I just am starting to get a bit frustrated. The player that we saw in CLOL, that we continue to see in CLOL, really be better than a lot of his competition, is going up against players now in Tier 2, and it's not, his mechanical superiority is not enough to hide the fact that he's playing one style of champion over and over and over again, and if Keel's going to lose leads in the early game, and Shogo's not going to be able to get online, well, he's going to get attacked and dove over and over again. His positioning is now getting worse. He's getting greedier in terms of his place. It's all falling apart for Supernova. This bot lane has to get back on track. This jungle has to get back on track, or this team is not going to reach the goals and expectations they had set for themselves. Again, the solo laners are not good, but they weren't expected to be the carries of this team. You need Keel and you need Shogo to be the two that are dominating, like Music and Levitate dominated on the other side of this matchup. That's the only thing that's going to save this team from going down into the relegation tournament. But this is a really big win for Blue Otter. I'm really excited to see if they can keep this momentum up. A lot of their hard games have been played, not all of them. It doesn't necessarily get a ton easier from here, but this team looks like top 6 at the very least, which means that they should be a playoff team. Alright, but that is going to do it for my NACL week number 5 overview and analysis video. Up on the screen, you can see the updated standings after 5 weeks of action. Just as a reminder, top 6 end up making playoffs here in the NACL. 7 and 8 are just done for the split. They keep their spot in Tier 2, but they do not make playoffs. And then 9 and 10 go down into the relegation tournament to see which 2 teams are going to qualify or re-qualify for the NACL in the summer split. So just as a reminder of where all these teams are standing, because we're getting very close to the end of the split. We can talk about where these teams are at and talk about my power rankings, which you can see to the right of every single team. We'll go over the risers and fallers. Not really a lot of changes. No real upsets this week, so let's go ahead and go over it. Top 3 staying the same. I get that DarkZero lost to Near Airport, but it was DarkZero Light. It was their B team taking on Near Airport, and mostly, I imagine, it was more of a test run for them, and just because they weren't able to keep up doesn't mean I think that the main DarkZero squad is any worse than what we thought they were. This is the first game loss that this organization has suffered all split long. They're going to stay at number 1. Luminosity still beat Near Airport, and they looked great this week, so they're going to stay at 2, and then Near Airport at 3. They are the 3 best teams in the league by far, and then I feel pretty vindicated having Conviction at 4 and CCG at 5 after this week. CCG still was able to come out with the win over Polestar, but they dropped a game, which isn't super good, and Conviction looked awesome in both of their series, so I'm going to keep them at 4, CCG at 5. Blue Otter will stay at 6. It's very clear they're better than the bottom 4, but not as good as the top 5. They're just kind of the middle team right now in the NACL. And then I am making a change between the collegiate teams here. It's Winthrop going up to 7. It's Supernova falling to 8. I've kind of put these two teams back and forth at 7 and 8 the entire split, but even as bad as Winthrop played, I think Supernova is just in such a free fall right now when their confidence is entirely shattered that I think Winthrop is going to finish this split better than Supernova, and so they're going to be above them right now, but I do still have both of them out of the bottom 2. AMI is in that bottom 2 still for me. I think in terms of raw talent, would I expect Supernova to beat AMI? I would. I know that obviously it's not that simple, but that's where I'm at right now in terms of predictions. Of course, Pulse is at 10. That's not really going to change. Let me know if you agree or disagree with my takes down in the comments section below, but let's go ahead and go over my player of the week and my dud of the week for week number 5. Player of the week was super easy for me. It's going to go to Darkwings, the mid laner for Conviction. Really glad to see him get back into form. He was incredible across week number 5. The only real hope is that he's going to be able to keep it up. If he's going to be able to play like this more consistently, Conviction will live up to that number 4 standing. His teammate Chrome is going to be my first honorable mention as well. Both of them were absolutely excellent in both of their series wins, and so both of them deserved some sort of shout, but Darkwings definitely was the player of the week for me. And then Tomio is going to get the other honorable mention, the jungler for Luminosity. He had a phenomenal series. Specifically, he had a great game number 1, and it's really nice to see him be able to establish tempo and just start to control a lot of the map. I'm not saying he's been bad this year, but we've been waiting for those superstar performances. He delivered on that here in week number 5. So those are my honorable mentions, and Darkwings is my player of the week, but my dud of the week is going to go to Only 35, the support for Winthrop. This was pretty easy to me. He got completely outplayed by Manui in terms of their series. Not to say that Manui is some awful support. He's been getting better and better, but it was not close, and he was a big reason why his team ended up not being successful. I like Only 35 as a player, but again, so much responsibility is on Mobility and Only 35 in that bot lane for Winthrop that when they don't win, it's more noticeable. So unfortunately for him, he's going to be my dud of the week, and Darkwings is going to be my player of the week, but that's going to do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We're going to be covering every week of the NACL going into playoffs as well, but we also cover all 4 of the major regions, LTA North, LEC, LCK, and LPL every single week on this channel. If you're interested in a comprehensive overview of everything going on in LoL Esports, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all